Okay.
Okay, so the title of this presentation, which hopefully will last 15 minutes, is, as you can see on your screen, Global Challenges and Sustainable Development, the need for a change of mindset. So I will talk about the SDGs, but I will offer you some reflections which might provoke you into something which is actually extremely needed and urgent in the times we live in. So there will be two major reflections that I will offer to you. But before the reflections, I would like to define sustainable development. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I'm defining it because, not because definitions are boring and not because I want to start in a boring way, but because so many people in these days talk about sustainable development, and sometimes I'm not even sure they truly know exactly what it means. If we look at the definition, something that I think should stand out is the expression future generations. And that should immediately put us into the right frame of mind, because far too often we're concerned with problems and challenges that are in the short term. While in fact, if we're thinking about future generations, i.e. our children, I'm sure many of us have children, then we should think much more in the longer term. Now, instead of thinking in the future, I want to go back to something that is here within this definition, but isn't obvious at all. And it's this date. It's the date when this definition was put forward. Now, the date is 1987. Now, 1987 may actually seem like a long time ago. It's not like 3 years ago or 17 years ago. It's much more. It's surprising in a way that it was put forward that long ago through a report called Our Common Future, which is actually a beautiful piece of writing. And I encourage you to read it and look at it. It's not particularly long. It was written by the World Commission on Environment and Development. So a very particular interaction here, environment and development. You might think, well, what happened after 1987? So many years have gone by. Actually, a lot of thinking and a lot of propositions and a lot of work happened. So we'll quickly just look at that. In the years after 1987, the thinking of the work that happened yielded, at the turn of the millennium, the so-called MDGs. MDGs. There were 8 goals, as you can see here. They were criticized in the following years for being a little bit anthropocentric, so very much centered on human societies. Why? Because only one was focusing on the planet, on the environment. It's actually because of the planet and our lack of respect for the environment that we actually create many of these other problems. But anyway, a lot of work took place. Unfortunately, limited progress. We saw limited progress across these MDGs. There was some progress in, for example, MDG number 4 of reducing child mortality. But the progress that we saw here and there was very uneven across countries worldwide. Now, what happened in 2015? New goals were released by the United Nations. These new goals were more detailed and more extensive. And these are the ones that I believe you have seen, and hopefully you have heard about them. There are 17, as you can see here. Now, I would like immediately to tell you that the reason why we're talking about this is because science and technology are essential to achieve these goals. Without science and technology, we will not be able to tackle some of these problems, which are complex, are interdisciplinary, and need the knowledge and solutions that can arise from good research. That's why you, as researchers and scientists, should be well aware of these goals and see how your work may fit in and how you may be able to help out. So, in order to reflect on this, I will propose 2 examples of reflections. I'll start with a very topical and present example. As you know well, societies worldwide are in the grip of a virus, of a pandemic. Now, when this arose early this year, many people, societies, governments, media, were surprised, they were shocked. I will argue with you that they should have not been surprised. So let's look at this research paper. For some reason, my presentation, okay, it's gone on. This research paper entitled Global Shifts in Mammalian Population Trends Reveal Key Predictors of Virus Spillover Risk. Now, please notice that this paper was received for publication in November 2019. This means that all the research that is within this paper is prior to the pandemic, okay? Let me show you now a second paper. This is a research paper. The second paper is a review, okay? This is a review. The title reads, A New 21st Century Science for Effective Epidemic Response. Again, this was received for publication in June 19, well before the pandemic, okay? Well before. One last example. Zoonotic host diversity increases in human-dominated ecosystems, received for publication January 19. January 19, again, this means that all the work in this research article was prior to the pandemic. So I show you 2 research articles and a review. Of course, the review refers and summarizes many, many research articles. So the first take-home message is plenty of scientific research, and therefore knowledge arising from that scientific research was available on the topic of infections, zoonotic diseases, and pandemics, even at the point of predicting the danger and the risk of such an event. So why on earth were societies, governments, and people so surprised? Well, obviously, because this scientific research does not go beyond being published in these scientific journals. Therefore, I showed you before this graphics with the statement at the bottom, science and technology are essential to achieve the SDGs. Sure they are, but unless the knowledge that arises from science and technology, unless the solutions and guidance that research provides are not properly conveyed, communicated, and taken into account, we're not going to go anywhere, are we? So let me now offer you a second reflection on another topic. And the topic is SDG 13 on climate action. Of course, I chose this topic because it's a topic that fell in the shadow of the pandemic. It's a topic that should have been at the top of the agenda in 2020, because last year, the United Nations announced that 2020 would be the year for climate action. Unfortunately, 2020 was not the year for climate action. When we talk about climate change, we very much talk about the increase in carbon dioxide. And as you can see here, this is the famous Keeling curve, which, by the way, you might not know about. Why? Because you're a scientist that perhaps is so focused on your narrow area of research that you don't know about other areas of research. But the Dr. Charles Keeling curve is extremely important because it shows how CO2 concentration has been increasing. Now, you know that CO2 is being discussed and talked about by many people, governments alike. However, its concentration keeps rising, and we should be actually talking about not only CO2, but other greenhouse gases as well. Because CO2 is not the whole story. So in fact, science has shown that if we talk about greenhouse gases, methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. So this diagram can tell you that in order to have the same heat trapped as so many CO2, so much amounts of CO2, we need so much less amount of methane, which means that if we were to take the same amount of methane and carbon dioxide, that amount of methane would trap over 20 times more heat. This means that methane is extremely powerful as a greenhouse gas. Nevertheless, I may ask you, have you heard much about methane? Have you heard it in the news? Have you heard governments or policymakers talk about methane? Are there any regulations or targets for methane? This is science. Science has shown, so physical and chemistry, atmospheric physical chemistry has shown that this is the case for years. Now, something that is being also coming through not only research, thankfully, also in the news in the past decade, is that methane emission from cattle are much higher than previously estimated. Why? Well, because in the rumen of cattle, the grass material, the fibers, the cellulose, is effectively digested by anaerobic bacteria called methanogens, which produce a very large amount, much larger, much more than we imagined previously. Only when scientists measured it, we were able to understand how much methane is actually produced. Now, if you think about how many cows actually there are, again, this is another interesting article that made its way in the news. Avoiding meat and dairy is the single biggest way to reduce your impact on Earth. And it's not, obviously now we know it's not just because of the CO2 associated with the cattle farming activities, but it's also because of the methane. Now, some good news. The beautiful thing is that for once, the scientific information has made its way through to some high-level entity which might actually affect policy making. So as you can see in this Nature News feature in August 2019, the title reads, "Eat Less Meat. UN Climate Change Report Calls for a Change to Human Diet." Even more recently, a few days ago, on the 6th of November 2020, this paper was published in Science. Global food system emissions could preclude achieving the 1.5 and 2 degree centigrade climate change targets. Global food system emissions. So I would like to use these two examples that I gave you, the one of COVID and the one of methane for climate change, reading to you this statement from the United Nations Competencies for Sustainable Development. In order to halt the current model of unsustainable development, societies must work on a change of mind behavior. Why? Because the two examples I gave you are just two examples. If we have time, we could have talked about many other areas of our lives, societies, and impact on the planet. This UNESCO graphics is really nice. I like it. It's about changing minds, not the climate. Okay, so we should be changing minds. Now, where to start? Well, I suggest we start with ourselves. The Nobel Prize winner and writer George Bernard Shaw wrote, "Progress is impossible without change. And those who cannot change their mind cannot change anything." That's why I wanted to reflect with you and provoke you to start with yourselves. There are massive online open courses. There are always topics that spring out from the SDGs, be it about energy or about climate or about biodiversity or about many other topics that you could decide to learn a little bit more on. Why? Because you've got the potential of affecting your students, your sons and daughters, your friends, your colleagues. If you do not look beyond these colorful icons, you will not contribute to any decent work towards these goals. You must look beyond these colorful icons because there are targets, specific targets. Each of these icons or numbers behind it has targets that have been thought through very carefully. If we don't do this, if we don't take some responsibility ourselves, we'll keep going down path number one, which is BAU, business as usual. Instead, we should try to push towards a different path, which will improve lives, not just for ourselves, but for our children, because it's the future generations we should be thinking about. So thank you for your attention. I went slightly over 15 minutes, I'm afraid. So I apologize if that's the case. Thank you, Bolanli, again for letting this topic into your program.